Thank you for continuing to join us on our RAS Virtual Summit. My name is Jean Coden, and I am the Associate Editor at RASTech Magazine. Joining me today is aquaculture economist Dr. Carol Engel. She has more than 40 years of research, extension, and teaching experience on the economics and marketing of the aquaculture industry. She has also served as past president of the U.S. Aquaculture Society and is the immediate past executive editor of the Journal of the World Aquaculture Society. Welcome, Carol. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
For the next 40 minutes, we will be talking about the business case of large-scale RAS. If you're just tuning in, you can send questions under the question section of your GoToWebinar control panel. We've had some lively participation there so far, so I'll be sure to keep an eye out on those throughout the session. I also want to mention that we have put together some additional resources under the handouts tab of the control panel. You can download those files at any time. We'll be referring to some of those during our conversation. So Carol, I want to begin with the main question for this session. As an aquaculture economist, what is the business case of building a commercial scale RAS facility? What do you see as the role of RAS in the larger aquaculture industry?
Well, obviously that's an important question. It's so exciting across my career generally with aquaculture to have seen the technology develop to be able to successfully raise fish and shrimp and RAS. Of course, the big question is the business case and the economic viability and demonstrating that. I think it's really important to always step back and kind of look at the big picture for any business, but it's sort of magnified with a RAS because RAS systems are so intensive by nature. So for any business, there are so many decisions that have to be made. There's really a multitude of different decisions, and all of those have to be the right ones for the business to work together. And so that's the real question is how to put those business models together and make them work. I think when you look at the broad spectrum across aquaculture generally, how RAS fits into that is really that it brings this whole new dimension. It brings a new dimension in terms of a production system, but it also offers opportunities to raise some other species that are not as well represented in the total mix of farm level production.
So what are the main considerations, do you feel, and when entering into a commercial scale RAS project?
There are many decisions and many considerations to be made. We've heard a lot about those earlier, from the financing to the marketing, and of course learning how to work with a particular system and raise the fish efficiently. But there are a couple of key considerations. We finished a study recently where we compared key cost drivers across a variety of production systems focused on the United States. There's one of the handouts presents a summary of that in the paper that's come out on that people may wish to look at. One of the considerations that's talked about quite a bit are economies of scale. So economies of scale are real in a business like a RAS where capital investment is quite intensive and quite strong. So economies of scale are real and they can be important, although smaller scale businesses can also be viable as well. But it's also equally important for all of the major costs of production to be managed on a very efficient sort of level. So when we look at RAS, it's not just the investment capital that has to be used efficiently, but it's also things like labor. Labor costs are fairly high in RAS, and so it's important to use that efficiently as well. In this study that I just referred to, one of the surprising things that came out of it was not that economies of scale exist. We've known that, and that's been discussed for many years with RAS. They are real and have to be dealt with in different ways. But what did jump out to me in this analysis is that the more standard established aquaculture sectors in the United States, like catfish production in ponds and trout production in raceways, make far more efficient use of labor and capital in terms of the cost per pound of fish produced than RAS do. And so one of those other considerations that I would throw out is to pay equally close attention to efficiency metrics of labor and capital, and not just economies of scale.
Do you have examples of some RAS business models that that are interesting to you? You've been studying this for many years, and what have you seen in terms of the RAS sector that's been interesting to you?
I try to watch all of aquaculture to the extent possible. It's becoming more difficult as it becomes more diverse and larger around the world, and more exciting to watch all of it. But clearly in the United States, where I live and spend more of my time in the United States, in terms of RAS, there are unfortunately not very many success stories, but there are some. And the criterion that I use in terms of success of any aquaculture business is whether it's been raising and selling fish profitably for more than 5 years, and it's not dependent on grant funding. And we have examples of those in the United States here, and there are examples in other countries as well. But in the United States, the clear largest success story of a commercial scale RAS is Blue Ridge Aquaculture in Virginia. They've been in business for 20 years. They're clearly successful. They've put together a successful business model. They've made it work. I think it takes really, I'll just use the word extraordinary, an extraordinary level of management skill in terms of raising the fish and knowing the fish, but being able to put a business model together that works well. And they're the clear example in the United States of a success story. They're a larger RAS that's successful, but we also have in the United States some smaller scale RAS businesses that have been in business sort of quietly for about 15 years in North Carolina, also raising tilapia, but they're successful. They've been in business for 15 years, and they're at a smaller scale in the neighborhood of hundreds of thousands of pounds and not millions of pounds of production. So the point is, it's possible to have smaller scale RAS. Economies of scale are not everything. It depends entirely on the business model. And so the ones that are interesting to me are the ones that are successful and have proven their success. When you talk with those individuals, they pay close attention to cost controls. They understand the market that they're in very, very well. They manage to integrate the various facets of that business, from production to marketing, and being able to keep that smooth supply of product going out and keeping their customers satisfied, and do it on a very, very efficient level, and pay very close attention to the sorts of efficiencies that I've talked about. Not just feed conversion, of course, that's important, but labor efficiency and cost and capital efficiency metrics as well. So there are clear success stories in spite of the many failures that maybe attract a little bit more press, unfortunately.
I also want to take some time to congratulate you on your newest book. So for those of you who don't know, it's called Aquaculture Businesses, A Practical Guide to Economics and Marketing. Can you talk a little bit about what it's about and who is this book for?
Certainly, Jean. I've written several books in the past that were more textbook oriented, were more technical, that I think had their place. But I was approached by 5M Publishing to take on the task of writing something that was more practical, for really geared more towards people trying to start an aquaculture business and invest in a business, and one that would be more oriented to producers, whether they were existing producers or prospective new producers. So that's what the book really is about. And so it provides step-by-step guidance in terms of all the different facets of managing an aquaculture business. So it approaches things and is relevant to RAS and pond-based systems and raceway-based systems as well. But it approaches it from how to make those all-important management decisions. It does not neglect or dumb things down, but it does avoid the use of more technical jargon, and avoids the use of equations and things like that. But it really presents those kinds of details. There's some things with aquaculture that are quite different from other forms of agriculture and from some other types of businesses as well that need fairly specific kinds of attention. In aquaculture, there's more risk. We heard from speakers today that they're pioneers with RAS. There are a lot of unknowns in aquaculture with raising new species and making a new production system really work and really function. And so in the United States and in member countries of the EU, there's something of a safety net for many farmers, but there is no equivalent safety net for aquaculture producers in these countries. And so the risk is real and it has to be dealt with. And so adequate planning and projecting and how to do that in a reliable, realistic, conservative manner is very, very important. And the book works through those kinds of decisions. It also talks about another really key important part is that of market development and creating markets. Because in working with many established aquaculture producers across the United States, those individuals had to create their own markets. Even though people already liked catfish, for example, people had to create their own markets. And so they had to develop supply chains. And so many aquaculture producers who enjoy working with fish maybe don't have the kind of a skill to be able to go out or don't realize from the outset that they really have to create a market and think in those kind of terms. So the book presents and spends some time talking about that and helping to introduce that to individuals.
So we have an audience question here about how should aquaculture farms balance risk with new technologies?
By spending a lot of time thinking and planning and worrying and examining many options and projecting those out. There's no question that new production systems like a RAS entail greater risk. There's no question about that from many perspectives. Any new business entails risk. And so obviously spending a lot of time talking with experts, spending a lot of time gathering as much real world information as possible, developing the financial statements that need to be developed, but then using those to think through best case scenarios, worst case scenarios, scenarios in between, and see how those play out across all of the financial statements and projections to get a sense of what is going to drive that business. There's a lot of information, there are a lot of business tools that people can use to run those kinds of simulations. For any number of species, there are online business tools that can be used. We have a series of budgets that are posted on the Virginia Tech website that people can look at, but there are many other business planning tools available, and from different sea grant and land grant extension services. The Maine Aquaculture Association has them. There are many out there, but spend the time looking at that. And then the all important question is, so what are the greatest risks? What's the worst thing that can happen? What can I do to balance that? And what can I do to minimize that risk? And then can I afford to do that? So risk of a power outage, you can have extra generators, for example, but can you afford, what size of generator can you afford? And can you afford that in your first year? Or do you have to generate capital to afford that in years 2, 3, and 4? There's no one set answer to that. It takes spending a lot of time modeling these things out, especially for new systems like RAS systems.
We have an audience question. Frederick Morgan wants to know, in your mind, what are the most important cost factors involved in a RAS project?
First of all, I'd like to refer all the readers to the literature that's emerging on this. There's some very good studies, and if people wish to contact me afterwards, I'm happy to forward it. But there's some very good studies that have come out recently. There's one study by Liu et al. That was based on a lot of the work that's been done over many years at the Freshwater Institute that provides a great deal of detail on the costs of RAS systems for salmon. There's a very good study by Trond Bjorndal that came out recently based on capital costs of commercial scale smolt production facilities in the EU. So these are reality-based ones. There's another one out of Canada by Boulay. And so look at those different studies. The one that my colleagues and I have put out recently that's in the handout use those 3 studies that I mentioned and then standardize them to make these comparisons across production systems. So there's a lot of literature to look at. Feed is a major cost in RAS, as it is in many fin fish production systems. Feed is a major cost, so it's important to be able to manage the system to keep feed costs low and to have a low feed conversion ratio, which is possible in RAS due to climate controls. But the capital cost is very high. And so what's important to remember with a high capital cost is that there has to be a return paid to that capital. If it's borrowed money to a bank, then you're paying an interest rate. But if you get that capital from an investor, that investor is going to want and need a return at some point. So capital has to be used efficiently. Labor is also a major cost in RAS that has to be used efficiently, and looking to hire and attract the kind of capital, the labor that is needed and the skills that are needed, but at a level that's affordable is a big question that I think merits a lot of attention. Then after that, in most systems, it becomes an energy cost that are some of the greatest costs in a RAS system.
Today, we've spent a lot of time talking about RAS projects in these developed countries in Europe and America, North America. We have some audience questions here about, we're curious about your take on developing countries and potential RAS projects there.
You know, it's really interesting to think about RAS or any specific production system for any specific country. I tend not to think of it in those terms. I think location decisions and what kind of aquaculture business is going to make sense is really quite site specific, because it is a business, and as a business there has to be the market, the business model, the size and the scope and the scale, and all these decisions have to fit together into one piece that makes sense, and those pieces all have to work together. So it's not a specific country, but it's looking at putting that business model together that makes sense. If somebody plans to export and target an export market, then they are going to have to be large scale. There are many things they're going to have to think about in choosing the species. If they're looking to supply fish or shrimp or some other product locally, then they need to understand what the demand is in terms of the volume and the size and the form and the product, and then step backwards to think about the best way to produce it. In some countries and some locations, the best way to produce a specific species is going to be ponds, and it's going to be ponds for a long time to come. I know this is a summit on RAS, but that's just a reality. To raise catfish in the United States, it's really tough to beat pond production, especially with the growth and intensification with a new technology called a split pond system that's been adopted in recent years in the South. Or those who wish to provide carp. Carp is going to be a preferred species in many countries for many years to come because it's a traditional historical fish, and it's probably best to produce a species like that in ponds unless land prices are very high. In countries where land values, or a site where land values are very high, pond production is not going to make a lot of sense because it takes a lot more land, and a RAS system may make more sense where land values are very high, but there has to be an energy source and a backup energy source. If it's a country or a site, there are sites in the United States where energy and the electrical supply is not that reliable in very remote locations in the United States. A RAS that's quite energy intensive and dependent on energy is not going to do as well in a place with an unreliable source of electricity. So it really comes down to the sites that are available in any particular country and putting this whole business model together. And I would urge people to step back a little bit and not just be locked into RAS. RAS makes a lot of sense in terms of location and in areas that may not be suitable for ponds or raceways. It makes a lot of sense to be able to locate closer to some important market areas. And and if the appropriate business models can be put together and made workable, it makes a lot of sense, but not everywhere. And pond-based systems and raceway-based systems are very sustainable production systems in the US and EU and elsewhere. So I would really urge people to think about their business and put a plan together that's going to work and make sense and is thought through very, very well to maximize the chances of it being successful, and not just automatically lock into one production system without doing a lot of thought and analysis about how this business is going to work and how you're going to meet your consumers and customers' needs.
We have Lynn Phantom here, who is a writer for RasTech and Hatchery International and our sister publication, Aquaculture North America. And she's asking an interesting question, which is, what do you feel are some leadership qualities that will characterize some of the most successful players in large-scale RAS?
Leadership qualities, that's always an interesting question. I think leadership qualities depend on individuals that are willing to assume the responsibility. They're not necessarily the people that would be the spokesperson for the business, but the leaders who are able to think through the various pieces, are able to assemble a team that is going to work well together, that has the right skills, but who shares the vision. A leader needs to have a vision for where the business is going and why it's going that direction and what the market is and how they're going to make all of this work. Then they have to attract the right people around them. A good leader is somebody who assembles that team of highly competent people, but also listens to them and assembles a team that will contradict the leader when they see something that may not be quite right. Somebody who supports their personnel and works to support the personnel, and an individual that is able to develop those effective relationships within the business, within the supply chain that are essential. Every business needs to have a good leader for it to be successful. Sometimes it needs somebody with quite a lot of backbone, because often businesses require making some very, very difficult decisions, especially in difficult times like we've experienced in 2020. But that's how I would describe a leader, but someone who is not going to throw the blame on somebody else when something goes wrong, but is going to support their people, take responsibility for making those difficult decisions and backing them up. But somebody who is also evidence-driven and data-driven and is able to admit they made a mistake and go a different direction when the data show that this is not working, especially for RAS that is still quite innovative and under development.
Since we're talking about sort of the leadership qualities here, I wanted to ask you, do you have any advice or insights for the industry to minimize their economic impact while we're in this pandemic? What do they need to take stock of financially right now?
Well, COVID is unprecedented in our lifetimes for certain, so there are no clear answers. And these are just difficult times for what has to happen. Every individual business is impacted slightly differently, although there are some broad trends of the impacts. But every business is different in terms of their labor structure, cost structure, and in many other ways. So every individual business really needs to be taking a hard look at all of their financial statements and looking at what the biggest problems are now and figuring out what's feasible to do for them. It's not feasible for everybody to pivot markets. For some people, it makes sense and they've been able to do it, to pivot to retail. For others, it's just not going to work at all, and it's not an option. I would suggest to people to understand some of these impacts. There were a couple of colleagues of mine at Ohio State University, Matt Smith, and Virginia Tech University, Dr. Jonathan Van Santen, who jumped out early on and did a survey of aquaculture producers in the United States, specifically to look at the impacts of COVID on their businesses. There's quite a lot of information, and one of the handouts has the URLs and links to the sites where the reports are located. They're doing this every quarter, And so there are reports there, 13 different reports for Q1 impacts and a number of reports for Q2 impacts. And they're gearing up to look at the Q3 impacts. So there are individual reports, an overview report, but then there are individual reports by species groups that people may wish to look at. There's some responses from aquaponics growers as well. But the immediate impact of COVID was this dramatic, sudden loss of sales. And we all know that most of our seafood is eaten in restaurants in the United States. So anybody raising food fish was hurt quite a lot very quickly. It wasn't even so much a price decline early on as it was just a total loss of markets where people could not sell anything at any price. So this was huge. And the first quarter of the year is peak demand and market period for much of the seafood we eat in the United States. So the impact was magnified due to the timing of the shutdowns and COVID. So the immediate impact was a loss of sales. That cascades down through everything. That results in very dramatic, very serious, very sudden cash flow problems that people had to contend with. And then that cascades, farther down in terms of it being planting season, stocking season. So what do you do when you have these live biomasses of product on your farm you weren't able to sell? Are you going to stock next year's crop or not? Are you going to euthanize some of those fish or not? You're going to double up, and knowing that you're increasing risk of disease by doubling up the biomass you're trying to contend with, knowing your aeration costs and other costs are going to go up. So the production challenges with getting inputs, labor shortages, and all these sorts of things. So there are no easy answers, and there are no easy solutions. The only real advice is to look at those financial statements long and hard, maintain detailed cash flow budgets, and those financial statements will give you clues as to where the biggest problems are and thoughts about how to try to work yourself out of it for your business and try to make the best possible decisions that you can. And that's what aquaculture producers are doing around the world right now to try to contend with COVID.
So we only have time for one last question here, and it's from Sean Starkman. He wants to know what you think about what the industry will and should look like in 10 years.
In 10 years?
Yes.
10 years. The overall aquaculture industry is going to grow around the world. There's no doubt in my mind. I'm just going to go ahead and say we're going to see more RAS businesses out there. We see commercial level successful businesses of smolt production in Norway. Those will continue to be successful and probably grow. I'm going to say we're going to have more and more food fish RAS businesses that have figured out how to be successful and economically viable. I think the beauty and excitement of the RAS is being able to locate those businesses in some areas that are not conducive to pond and raceway production. And that's going to enable aquaculture to happen in some areas that haven't had a lot of aquaculture in the past and bring in this whole other dimension. I believe RAS is going to be amenable to raising some species on a farm level at a higher production level than we've seen before. So I believe that aquaculture will grow with greater production from marine finfish species, likely in RAS is what I think. But I also think we're still going to have shellfish produced with all kinds of gear along our coasts and around the world. And I also think we're still going to have some species like catfish being raised in ponds with split ponds and other intensive, and we'll have pond production of sport fish occurring in the US and elsewhere, and carp production in ponds around the world. I don't see that disappearing and going away, and I don't see trout production in raceway going away. Those are well-managed businesses that have learned how to operate very efficiently and develop their markets. So what I really see in 10 years is aquaculture will be much bigger, and RAS will become a more important part of overall aquaculture because it brings this new dimension in terms of location of that kind of a system, and it offers opportunities to raise more of these higher value marine species on a higher level than ever before. That's the way I would answer it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Engel. There's so much more we can talk about, but as we wrap up here, I want to thank Everyone who submitted questions, if I wasn't able to ask your question today, we have, Carol has graciously given out her contact information. So if you want to pick her brain a little bit more, her email is right down below. Thank you again, Carol, for sitting down with us at the RAS Virtual Summit.
Thank you, Jean. It's been a pleasure.